Alright everybody, welcome back to my YouTube channel. This is the Jordan Report. I am your host, Robert Jordan. And I want to do a report on the recent violence in Chicago. And it's something I've been watching a while because I was raised in the inner city and I know a little something about gangs and, the street world. And all this shooting in Chicago really struck me as kind of odd. It just didn't seem like your regular black on black crime that I was raised around in the inner city. So let me go through a few articles and see what we can look at. This was August 19th. 28 individuals were shot, 5 fatally over the weekend in Democrat-controlled Chicago. NBC Chicago reports the first of the weekend's fatality was a double murder that occurred in a shooting around 4 p.m. Friday. The fatality occurred Sunday evening when a 41-year-old man was shot twice and killed on South Crilly. Earlier Sunday, a 46-year-old woman was shot and killed while driving southbound in the 5100 block of South Prairie. The other shooting fatality occurred around 4 a.m. Saturday when a 45-year-old man driving a car was shot by a man who was standing on the sidewalk. As you can see, the randomness of this, it's just random killing. And it goes from male to female, old to young. You have to pay attention to these stories over time. You know these are just random shootings. Breitbart News reported that 47 people were shot, 4 fatally over Chicago over the weekend of August 9 through 11, 2019. 53 individuals were shot, 7 killed in Democrat-controlled Chicago during the first weekend of August, and 48 were shot, 9 fatally, during the last weekend of July. These are just over the last few weeks. Now, I'm going to go to the last week prior to this one. This is the new mayor of Chicago, Lightfoot. This is the week prior to what I was just talking about. 48 people were shot, 9 fatally over the weekend in Democrat-controlled Chicago. This is 2 weeks worth of violence, okay? CBS Chicago reports that the shooting victims included people walking, standing outside gas stations, and standing on sidewalks. When you read these things over time, you see the randomness of this. These are not people that's involved in anything. These are people just walking down the street, driving a car, sitting on a porch, old, young, male, female. In one of the incidents, a 15-year-old, a 14-year-old, a 10-year-old were shot when a Toyota drove by the sidewalk on which they were standing and opened fire. The wounds proven superficial and 3 boys were in good condition at Stroger Hospital. This was a 15-year-old, a 14-year-old, and a 10-year-old were shot when a Toyota drove by the sidewalk they were just standing on. Okay? The most recent fatality of the weekend occurred just before 5 a.m. Police found a 24-year-old man dead in the North Lawndale neighborhood. He had multiple gunshot wounds, including to his face and head. The 4 dozen victims shot July 26 and 20 through 28 are the latest in a string of victims in the Democrat-controlled Chicago. Breitbart News reported at least 43 people were shot, 2 fatally over the weekend of July 19 through 21. At least 41 people were shot, 9 fatally over the weekend, July 12 to 14. And at least 66 people were shot, 5 fatally over the 4th of July weekend. 56 people were shot, 4 fatally the weekend prior to the 4th. This is 1 month of violence in Chicago. In the middle of America. Can you believe that? I don't believe that. I don't believe that's possible. There has to be something more to this, and this is what the next story leads to. One of the Kennedys ran for governorship of Illinois last year, and he said some very profound things. Things that were very interesting, things that I was thinking about all along. This is Chris Kennedy. This is July 4th, 2018. He was running for governor. Kennedy accused Emmanuel of a strategic gentrification plan to force blacks out of Chicago. Democrat governor candidate Chris Kennedy on Wednesday accused Mayor Rahm Emanuel of leading a strategic gentrification plan aimed at forcing African Americans and other minorities out of Chicago to make the city whiter and wealthier. I believe that black people are being pushed out of Chicago intentionally by a strategy that involves disinvestment in communities being implemented by the city administration. And I believe Rahm Emanuel is the head of the city administration and therefore needs to be held responsible for those outcomes, Kennedy said during a news conference about gun violence in North Lawndale. This is involuntary, that we're cutting off funding for schools, cutting off funding for police, allowing people to be forced to live in food deserts, closing hospitals, closing access to mental health facilities. What choice do the people have but to move, to leave, Kennedy added. And that's part of the strategic gentrification plan being implemented by the city of Chicago to push people of color out of the city. The city is becoming smaller, and as it becomes smaller, it becomes whiter. All right, I'm going to show you the news conference, and then I'm going to close this out with one last article. Here's the news conference.
Allegation today made by Chris Kennedy, who's running for governor. He claims Mayor Rahm Emanuel is behind a plan to push African Americans out of the South Lakefront to enrich his wealthy friends in real estate. CBS 2 political reporter Derek Blakely brings us the story.
At a Westside news conference where he picked up support from prominent African Americans, Chris Kennedy spoke to a long-held belief by some in the black community.
Instead of using our resources to revitalize our city, we're cutting off resources to push people of color out of our city and perhaps out of the way of economic development.
Kennedy then alleged historic Bronzeville is in Mayor Emanuel's sights.
It will be a development play, but not for the residents who have lived there for years and years and who are being pushed out, but instead for a new wave of gentrification that defines a city which, as it gets smaller, is becoming whiter.
And Kennedy lampooned Emanuel's promises that crime and violence are down.
Not to the people in North Lawndale, he can't. Not to people in lots of neighborhoods in this city where crime continues to increase, not decrease.
Police Superintendent Eddie Johnson fired right back. I'm not a politician, but I do take issue when the hard work our men and women are doing to beat back this violence is used to score political points.
What choice do people have but to move, to leave? And I think that's part of a strategic gentrification plan being implemented by the city of Chicago to push people of color out of the city.
A spokesman for the mayor flatly denies Kennedy's allegations, saying it's sad to see Chris Kennedy using cynical, politically motivated attacks about Chicago's communities for his own personal gain. They are a direct result, they are a direct assault on one of this city's great strengths, our diversity. Also, Kennedy picked up endorsements today from Congressman Bobby Rush and Danny Davis, as well as the father of murdered teenager Hadia Pendleton. Rob and Erica, Kennedy is clearly attacking the mayor on violence, seeking to nail down black support. But of course, it's billionaire J.B. Pritzker and State Senator Daniel Biss he has to defeat in the primary, not Rahm Emanuel.
So Kennedy with Bronzeville talking about the mayor trying to push out African Americans. Is he pointing to any specific relationships or plans that are in place related to the mayor or even the city?
Well, I think it's an implied reference to Rahm Emanuel's close ties to developers in the city and, of course, also to venture capitalists that he was associated with before he became mayor. I think he's trying to tie Rahm in with that kind of wealthy elite. But it wasn't a direct connection. It was kind of an implied one.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he's not running against Rahm. Although
exactly.
It sure does sound like it right there. All right.
Okay, remember, that was over a year ago. That was April of last year. Since that time, we got a black mayor. April of last year, okay? Has any of the violence stopped? Okay, well, this is April of this year, excuse me. This was last year, but we got a new mayor, and none of the violence has stopped since April of this year, okay? In fact, it's only gotten worse. And so, since last year, when Chris Kennedy said that this was happening, all the way until this year, how many people have been killed? You've probably seen the list by now. Some folks are calling it Black Woman Magic. This is the Chicago Tribune. If Chicago is a black political mecca, why are African Americans leaving the city in droves? That's what the article's about. Since Lori Lightfoot's historic victory last week, the list has been passed around proudly as a symbol of achievement of African American women in the Chicago area. While hardly anyone was paying attention, black women rose up and took charge of the most high-profile positions in our city and county government. If you throw in the African American men, also in top spot, the change in political tide is even more astounding. I have a question, though. If our city has really become the political mecca it appears to be, why are African Americans leaving Chicago in droves? The question should be, why are black people being killed in droves? You got a black police chief. Obviously, something is wrong in Paradise. Everyone knows that Lightfoot will become Chicago's first African American female mayor next month. But Toni Preckwinkle's loss in the heated mayoral race allows her to retain another top position, president of the Cook County Board of Commissioners. She also happens to be the chair of the Cook County Democratic Party. Well, we'll also get Melissa Conyers-Irvin, who won last week's runoff for city treasurer. She joins Cook County State Attorney Kim Foxx. Chicago Public Schools CEO Janice Jackson. Cook County Circuit Court Clerk Dorothy Brown. Avis Lavelle, president of the Chicago Park District Board of Commissioners. And Carrie Steele, president of the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District for Greater Chicago. These are all black people. These are all black people. They run the city. And don't forget, we got Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton down in Springfield. Lieutenant Governor. Now add the black men. Chicago has an African American police superintendent and a black fire chief. Black men also head the Chicago Transit Authority, the Chicago Housing Authority, the Chicago Board of Education, and the Board of Chicago City Colleges. Add to that an African American Attorney General for Illinois and the Secretary of State. Black people in Chicago should be some of the richest people in the country. Chicagoans are beyond being shocked when an African American lands in a high position. Most of us have come to accept it as the norm. We elected Carol Moseley Brown as the nation's first African American female U.S. Senator more than 25 years ago. The first African American president gained his political footing in Chicago as well. Does that really make a difference now? The average Joe in West Garfield Park, among the city's communities with the highest poverty rates, highest homicide rates, and lowest life expectancy rates. It's nice to be able to pat ourselves on the back for being a progressive city. When it comes to electing diverse leaders, these are not diverse leaders. These are black people. There's nothing diverse about this. But it's mostly a facade. This is part of the reason Chicago may have had a record low 32% voter turnout rate in last week's historic election, according to unofficial results. Many of the low numbers were prominently black American precincts. Black people probably just giving up. I would have. I would just quit giving up voting for Democrats. Most of the people don't have a lot of confidence in politicians regardless of their skin color. For African Americans on the south and west side areas that have historically seen more broken promises from City Hall than any other group, the apathy is unfortunate but understandable. Not only are black people not voting, they're packing up and leaving the city by the thousands. Black people are running Chicago, you guys. We can't blame anybody. There's nothing going on there but black people. Okay? Let's start holding these people accountable. Make these people do their job.